This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So the story I want to tell and the project itself started with my discovery of a trial that took place in the small Galician town of Wadowice in 1889. And this is a town that is now best known as the birthplace of Pope John Paul II. But at the time, it was known throughout Austria-Hungary as the site of a trial of a group of Jewish travel agents from the nearby town of Oświęcim, which is better known to the world today as Auschwitz. Oświęcim, which was located at the juncture of Prussian, Russian, and Austrian railway lines, had recently developed a booming emigration business. Since 1880 or so, hundreds of thousands of East Europeans were trekking toward the German ports of Hamburg and Bremen en route to America. The 65 defendants in this case were accused of seducing immigrants into abandoning their homeland with false promises of American riches. In reality, the prosecutors argued, East European peasants were being delivered to hard labor in American factories, mines, and brothels. The defendants stood trial for fraud, smuggling, bribery, assault, and generally swindling immigrants of their last heller as they set out for America. If this trial had been just another expose of corruption in a small East European city, it might have passed unnoticed. But the case quickly came to implicate much more than a group of shady travel agents. As the prosecuting attorney argued in his closing statement, the trial was a referendum on emigration itself, which he called one of the most important burning problems of the day. And emigration, he insisted, posed a grave threat to the basic ideal of freedom in the Habsburg Empire. He claimed that the travel agents of Oświęcim were guilty of no less than, quote, introducing a slave trade into the free land of Austria. The trial of Wadowice marked the beginning of a century-long campaign to prevent emigration from East Central Europe. Throughout the Cold War, freedom and democracy itself were often defined in terms of freedom of mobility. So while citizens of Western democracies were supposedly free to come and go, citizens of socialist states in Eastern Europe were captives of their own governments, immobilized by guns and barbed wire. The Iron Curtain did not simply descend overnight in 1945, 1948, or 1961, however, nor was it simply a Soviet imposition. Beginning already in the late 19th century in the Habsburg Empire, government officials and social reformers began to panic about the massive exodus of citizens from east to west. Their anxieties were framed in terms of humanitarian ideals. Officials feared that East Europeans were destined to become victims of exploitative wage slavery in America and Central Europe. Conscious of Eastern Europe's precarious state between the so-called developed West and the colonial world, they also worried that Slavs would become the slaves of the 20th century. So this debate about immigration was, from the outset, linked to a broader discussion about the meaning of slavery, freedom, and free labor in the context of a globalizing labor market. Freedom has long been associated with mobility and movement in American self-understanding. Well before the Cold War, freedom had become a key word in U.S. politics, although the meaning of that term has never been fixed. In early and colonial America, for example, captivity narratives in which Native American savages captured or enslaved Christian settlers were central to the construction of American identity. The historian Susan Carruthers sees the Cold War captivity narrative, in which East Europeans were represented as captives behind the Iron Curtain, as a kind of 20th century variation on this American theme. During the Cold War, she argues, Americans defined freedom in opposition to alleged captivity, immobility, and slavery in the Eastern Bloc. Freedom has also persistently been defined in racialized terms in the United States in relation not only to Native Americans, but also to transatlantic slavery and its legacies. Since the physical bondage of human bodies was essential to the experience of slavery in North America and South America, physical mobility occupied a central place in abolitionist visions of freedom. This association of mobility and freedom was never unique to the United States, however. As Adam McKeon has shown in his work on Chinese migration, the ideal of the free migrant, which was defined in opposition to the slave or the indentured servant, has been a cornerstone of global migration politics since the abolition of slavery. At first glance, this global history of abolition, indentured servitude, slavery, contract labor may seem pretty distant from the concerns of officials in Vienna, Budapest, and Krakow. But Habsburg officials were in fact highly conscious of the Austrian Empire's precarious position between an imagined West and the colonized world. While the notion of the Second World is a Cold War invention, and it would be anachronistic to talk about the Second World here, I think it somehow helps to illuminate the attitudes of East European officials toward mass emigration at the turn of the century. Insisting that their citizens should enjoy the privileges and protections of white Europeans, Habsburg officials and social reformers specifically sought to distinguish East European emigrants from colonial labor, anxious to guarantee that their citizens would not become the coolies or the slaves of the new century. Population loss had, of course, been on the minds of European rulers long before the 1880s. Early modern rulers generally subscribed to mercantilist economic theories, which valued population as a motor of economic development and as a source of political power. By the early to mid-19th century, however, mercantilist theories were giving way to a kind of Malthusian pessimism throughout Europe. An exit revolution swept Europe, Aristide Zolberg argues, as states lifted restrictions on movement. So the Frankfurt Parliament of 1848, for example, declared that freedom of emigration may not be restricted in the interests of the state, while Article 4 of the Austrian Constitution of 1867 guaranteed every citizen the right to exit the Habsburg Empire. Historians of migration, therefore, tend to see the mid to late 19th century as a kind of golden age of free movement. It was only after the First World War in this story that xenophobia in the West, the expansion of state power, and economic crisis brought the end to a kind of golden age of open borders. Viewed from the other side of the Atlantic and the other side of Europe, however, a significant history of European immobility emerges from the 19th century onward. Well before America's 1924 Johnson-Reed Act introduced the quota system that suppressed mass immigration to the United States, powerful forces in both Europe and America conspired to curtail mobility for their own reasons. Populationist policies proliferated across Europe in the early 20th century, but the East European preoccupation with suppressing emigration was distinctive in both its intensity and its longevity. So the Italian and German governments, for example, actively promoted emigration in the late 19th century, but simultaneously created a lot of ambitious social and cultural institutions that were designed to protect the loyalty and cultivate the loyalty of emigrants overseas. In the absence of a large colonial empire, many Italian and German officials actually saw immigration as a way of projecting their economic and cultural influence around the world. Numbers alone offer some clue as to how and why immigration became such a burning issue in Austria-Hungary at the turn of the century. In the first decade of the 20th century alone, 1 in 10 citizens, more than 5 million people, left the Habsburg Empire. The largest number departed from the impoverished Austrian provinces of Galicia and the Bukovina and from southern and eastern Hungary. An additional 500,000 workers migrated seasonally, mostly across the German border. Between 1901 and 1910, almost 25% of all immigrants to the United States hailed from the Habsburg lands, and this was in the decade in which the more migrants than ever came to and half of that number came from the Austrian part of the monarchy. Leopold Caro, a Polish lawyer who opposed emigration, described villages that became ghost towns overnight. Many houses stood empty, and in many others only old women and small children remained behind. Everyone believed that America was the promised land, a true paradise. I should say that in this period, at least, there was a huge amount of return migration as well. So actually, an estimate somewhere between probably around 30% of people returned. Most people, many people were doing short-term visits. It's very hard to know the exact numbers, but it's a large number that were either returning or going back and forth. In the eyes of many Austrian social reformers and government officials, the propaganda of duplicitous travel agents was a major cause of this emigration boom. By blaming mass emigration on Jewish agents, anti-immigration activists cast migrants themselves as innocent victims of Jewish and capitalist exploitation. It's common knowledge, declared the Austrian War Ministry in 1913, that the majority of emigrants do not actually decide to emigrate out of their own initiative or because of their economic situation, but are rather induced to emigrate by the immoral, speculative activity of emigration agents. Blaming and arresting travel agents was also a much simpler and less costly solution to the perceived migration crisis than addressing the underlying economic inequalities within Austria and beyond that were actually propelling mass emigration. And while I'm focusing here on the story of one trial, this strategy for policing immigration by policing travel agents was really widespread. By 1914, over 3,000 agents were facing criminal charges in the Austrian half of the monarchy. The complete trial records of the Wadowice case, unfortunately, appear to be missing. If anybody knows where they are, let me know. But I've searched the local archives around Krakow and other places, and I haven't been able to find them. Local, regional, and imperial newspapers across the political spectrum all did send reporters to Galicia, however, and many of these newspapers published daily transcripts of the trial as well as commentary, editorials, updates. Even with this source space, we don't really know all the facts. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this is that there haven't really been any full-blown histories of this trial, but the works that do exist have actually generally presumed that all of the accusations against the agents were true and missed the fact that it was an anti-Semitic trial entirely. The Austrian War Ministry clearly had a hand in the affair. Alarmed by the number of Galician men who failed to appear for military service, the Interior Ministry requested Galician authorities to mobilize against illegal emigration in May of 1888. On June 17th, the Galician governor ordered local officials to scrutinize the activities of agents in Oświęcim in particular, and a month later the defendants were arrested in a 4 a.m. raid on their offices. Simon Herz and Julius Lohenberg founded their travel agency in Oświęcim in the early 1880s. Prosecutors in the anti-Semitic press depicted a mafia-like organization. Train conductors, police officers, cab drivers, and government officials were all allegedly on the agency's payroll. But the most sensational accusations concerned the treatment of immigrants as they passed through town. When migrants arrived at the train station en route to Germany, thick-muscled drivers employed by competing agencies purportedly surrounded them on the platform. Quote, they beat each other up with fists and sticks, and after fighting it out, these henchmen drove the captured immigrants to the agencies like cattle, claimed the anti-Semitic Deutsche Volksblatt. And the reference to cattle is not insignificant because a lot of Jews were cattle traders in this region, so the accusation that people were being treated like animals was a common one. The fraud allegedly continued once the so-called herd of slaves arrived in Herz's office. Mr. Lohenberg, costumed in the uniform of an Austrian civil servant, reportedly met incoming immigrants. His colleagues addressed him as Mr. Prefect or Mr. Bezirkshauptmann. Photos of Emperor Franz Josef and imperial insignia adorn the office walls so as to make it look like an Austrian imperial office. The agents first ordered immigrants to turn over their passports and money, strip searching them to extract bills sewn into their clothing or hidden in their socks and undergarments. They then purportedly informed the unfortunate peasants that it was illegal to purchase a ticket from any other firm and threatened them with arrest and violence if they refused. Even once the poor immigrant purchased a ticket, the abuse didn't end. Agents insisted that it was necessary to make a phone call to the shipping company in Hamburg in order to reserve a place on the ship. A second call had to go out to the Emperor of America in order to save space in the American Promised Land. Immigrants were allegedly charged for both of these phone calls, which were made using an alarm clock. Finally, the agents would inform immigrants that they wouldn't be permitted to enter America wearing traditional peasants' clothing. Fortunately, they could purchase American suits at outrageous prices in Mr. Lohenberg's store next door. While they waited for the train to Germany, prosecutors claimed that agents held the immigrants captive, sometimes for days, locking them in pig stalls and dark basements where they were charged exorbitant prices for bad bread and weak beer. Most of these sensational stories originated in local denunciations by anti-Semites. Shortly before the arrests, a group of Poles in Oświęcim addressed a petition to Georg von Schonerer, the famous anti-Semitic leader of the Austrian pan-German movement. Vincenzo Vronsky, a craftsman in town, was a leader of the group. He testified in Wadowice that they had written the petition, quote, because we saw with our own eyes how the Jews sent young men who had not completed their military service to America. But if the Defense Ministry and local anti-Semites set the Wadowice case in motion, its spectacular resonance reflected a much broader set of concerns. At first glance, it's tempting to blame the degree of alarm about immigration on a longer history of feudal labor practices in Eastern Europe. And some of the most vocal opponents of immigration were actually Polish and Hungarian nobles who feared losing a cheap source of agricultural labor to American factories and mines. But I think it would be a mistake to conclude that this anxiety about immigration was merely a feudal hangover. Rather, immigration reformers drew on mercantilist and populationist principles that were well entrenched in European political and economic thought. In a 1912 treatise against immigration, for example, Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek warned that proponents of immigration had, quote, forgotten the basic principles and theories of political economy, which teach that the human is an essential link in the chain of the economy, that his labor is a valuable asset, and that the use of this labor is above all the right of the state that has made the effort to raise and educate this human material. New concerns also drove the emigration panic in the late 19th century, however. Experts in the growing field of demography, eugenics, and social policy were refining the goal of increasing population by focusing more and more on the biological quality of the state's human material. Anti-immigration activists warned that the harsh physical labor and long hours endured by workers in America posed a deadly threat to the physical and moral health of Austrian immigrants. Hayek claimed that more than 30,000 Austro-Hungarian citizens were killed on the job in American industrial accidents every year. An even greater number supposedly returned home physically disabled, becoming public charges, quote, as a consequence of forced enervating labor that is detrimental to physical health. And I should say here that while this rhetoric sounds very polemical, it was meant to be, he kind of had a point in that Austria, Hungary, and Germany both had much better worker protection laws in this period, including industrial accident insurance and various forms of pensions and so on that existed in the United States, where workers' compensation didn't come around until in many places until the 1920s or 30s, and then on a state-by-state basis. The Wadowice trial also reflected the growing radicalism of Austrian anti-Semitism. It's difficult to know precisely what percentage of emigration agents were actually Jewish, but it's clear that Jews were heavily represented in the ranks of agents who were prosecuted by the Austrian government. A 1910 list of agents suspected of criminal activity in Galicia included 64 individuals, 53 of whom had Jewish names. Out of a sample taken by me of 284 criminal cases underway in November of 1913, more than half of the defendants had Jewish names. Regardless of whether or not the majority of agents self-identified as Jews, the emigration business was tightly linked to Jews in the imagination of anti-Semites. The period from 1880 to 1900 also brought the rapid rise of populist anti-Semitic movements across Europe, accompanied by an outbreak of sensational anti-Semitic trials. Within a period of 20 years, blood libel trials took place in Hungary, Prussia, and Bohemia. In Lviv, Lemberg, Lvov, there was a spectacular anti-Semitic trial of accused white slavers in 1892 as well. While defrauding immigrants was definitely a much less sensational charge than blood libel or sex trafficking, I think that the Wadowice trial really fit within this broader pattern. The language that prosecutors used to denounce Jewish agents in the press and in the courtroom, they were called human traffickers, parasites sucking on our blood, and vampires, for example, belonged to the standard vocabulary of both blood libel trials and the white slavery panic. Quote, this trial is taking place because it is impossible to tolerate the existence of human trafficking at the end of the 19th century, a trade in the blood of 10,000 impoverished people, insisted the prosecuting attorney at Wadowice. The implied link between emigration and sex trafficking was particularly significant. By equating male workers trafficked to American mines and factories with Galician women trafficked to our Argentinian brothels, emigration reformers conjured up popular anti-Semitic images of Jews as predators and sex traffickers. Both the white slavery panic and the immigration panic, interestingly enough, also targeted Jews for their alleged role in moving people across borders and commodifying human beings. And it's interesting because a lot of the literature on anti-Semitism has focused on Jews being targets of anti-Semitism because of their own alleged cosmopolitanism, but here they're being targeted because they're moving other people across borders. Anti-immigration activists were also deeply concerned about the threat that emigration seemed to pose to global racial hierarchies. These fears became explicit in 1907 when the Austro-Americana shipping line introduced direct steamship service from Trieste to Louisiana. As recruiters from Louisiana and Georgia began to prowl the Austrian countryside in search of cotton pickers, Habsburg officials responded with alarm. Polemical denunciations of the emigration business as a form of human trafficking reached a new key as rumors spread that Austrian peasants were literally replacing former slaves in the American South. In 1908, an Austrian consular official reported from Atlanta, quote, "All examples have proven that racial mixing brings forth very unfortunate results. The states with a large mixed population are culturally, economically, and morally backward." Since Austrian immigrants would inevitably, quote, "live and work with the Negroes on southern plantations," he concluded that the only possible consequence is that our people will be brought down to the level of the Negroes and that they will hardly be better treated. The same year, the Austrian Interior Ministry alerted Galician officials that, quote, "complaints about the entrapment of immigrants in unfree slave-like conditions, peonage, have in some cases proven to be well-founded." Only a year after it had started, the Austro-American service to New Orleans was canceled. East European emigration, of course, was provoking anxieties about racial and civilizational hierarchies in the United States as well. In 1910, Booker T. Washington himself, accompanied by University of Chicago sociologist Robert Park, set out to Eastern Europe to investigate the causes of mass emigration to America. Washington's self-declared mission was to hunt for what he called the man farthest down on the European continent. In the process, he projected the racial politics of the American South onto the terrain of Imperial Austria, which he consistently referred to as Southern Europe, which is kind of interesting. By the end of his journey, he had concluded that the peasants, workers, and Jews of Eastern Europe actually had it much worse than African Americans in the South. Quote, "There are few plantations in our southern states where one would not find the colored people living in more real comfort and more cleanliness than was the case here," he argued. Washington speculated that the arrival of millions of impoverished East Europeans would even create a new kind of racial problem in America. Whatever else one may say of the Negro, he is, in everything except his color, more like the southern white man, more willing to and able to absorb his ideas and the culture of the white man and adapt himself to existing conditions than is true of any other race which is now coming into the country. And of course, American nativists agreed with this assessment and only a few years later imposed the strict quotas on the number of East Europeans who could enter the United States. The Vada Vitae trial and the debate about emigration was ultimately a forum for expressing deeper anxieties about capitalism, migration, and Austria-Hungary's place in the world. Fears that white Austro-Hungarian citizens might be reduced through emigration to the status of feminized coolies, sex slaves, or black plantation workers animated both popular and official anxieties about immigration. According to the state's attorney, the Vada Vitae trial was to serve as a warning and a cleansing process for Austrian society. In his closing statement, the prosecutor appealed to the jury to convict the, quote, "parasites that have lived in the blood of our peasants in the name of the land of our fathers for the good of the state and the defense of them both." And the jury obliged. On the 12th of March, 1889, the principal defendants were convicted and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. Not surprisingly, the arrest, trial, and ultimate imprisonment of Oświęcim's travel agents did not effectively slow the emigration from Eastern Europe. The number of Austrians leaving for North America skyrocketed in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. Restrictions on immigration also intensified, particularly in the years leading up to the Balkan Wars and the First World War, especially due to fears about draft evasion. By early 1914, control stations had been erected all along Austria's western borders. Ignacy Vogel, a Galician socialist delegate to the Austrian parliament, protested in early 1914, quote, "The entire empire has been surrounded by a police barrier so that even a bird might not be able to fly across our borders." But in the context of the rush to war, his protest was relatively isolated. With fears of mass desertion growing and in the name of humanitarian values, Austrians casually sacrificed freedom of mobility on the eve of World War I. The First World War, of course, temporarily solved the emigration problem. Transatlantic passenger travel virtually ceased during the war. But the emigration issue did not go away entirely. An Austrian consul who was stationed in St. Paul, Minnesota, concocted a particularly radical plan for post-war Austria. In 1915, he proposed that all immigration to the United States be completely banned after the war. This ban, he claimed, would bring the American steel and coal industries to their knees, since they were supposedly so reliant on East European labor, and enable Austria to retain valuable human material for its own use, since, quote, it is precisely the most physically and intellectually productive elements that which are lost to their homeland, and the qualitatively less valuable human material, the crude rubble, that remains at our disposal. His proposal actually circulated to government ministries in both Austria and Hungary and was taken very seriously. While most officials ultimately disagreed with the plan, they didn't contest its underlying principles. They simply recognized that it was impractical. The Hungarian Interior Minister presciently understood that far more radical measures would be required to completely seal the monarchy's borders. Emigration could be successfully curtailed completely, he argued, quote, only if all of our neighboring states take the same position with respect to emigration, which we can hardly count on. If the number of East Europeans on the move declined between the wars, thanks in part to the stringent new immigration quotas in the United States as well as Britain and elsewhere, the level of concern surrounding emigration actually intensified. One of the first priorities of East Central Europe's new self-declared nation-states was to prevent people from leaving them. While some East European authorities criticized the racist foundation of the American Johnson-Reed Act, which specifically discriminated heavily against migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, others actually celebrated the new quota system as a blessing in disguise. Jan Jilk of the Masaryk Academy of Labor in Czechoslovakia reflected that the new restrictions, quote, may have positive consequences for us at the end of the day. As an imperial Austria, population size was linked to economic development and military strength. But now immigration policy was also linked to an important new priority, building homogenous nation-states. Eastern Europe's new self-declared democratic nation-states all sought to engineer homogenous populations by preventing the emigration of nationally desirable citizens while encouraging the departure of members of minority groups. Hungary kept its pre-war immigration laws in force, but they were already the most restrictive in Europe. Romania banned emigration altogether. In Yugoslavia, the government introduced policies that were explicitly intended to make it more difficult to obtain a passport while quietly encouraging members of undesirable national minorities to emigrate. The Polish government banned seasonal migration to Germany altogether, a ban that was maintained until 1926, outlawed advertising for emigration, established new passport requirements, and negotiated new treaties to protect migrant social rights. At the same time, the Polish government encouraged the emigration of Jews and Ukrainians in particular. In Czechoslovakia, a new 1922 immigration law explicitly affirmed that emigration was an individual freedom, but the law simultaneously affirmed that that the government could limit that freedom if emigration threatened the public interest, without really defining what that meant. A new 1928 law also empowered the state to deny passports to anyone whose travel could threaten important state security interests or economic interests of the Czechoslovak Republic. The law was explicitly intended to curb the travel of what were called habitual globetrotters. Local police and passport offices enjoyed fairly wide latitude to interpret and enforce these laws. So in one district in the Subcarpathian Rus, for example, officials refused passports to children and all women of any age unless they were traveling to or with a male guardian. They also systematically denied passports to individuals who could, quote, find work here if they made a genuine effort. The Yugoslav and Polish governments deployed similar tactics. So without banning immigration outright, they sought to obstruct it through back-channel administrative delays. Anxieties about immigration did not only lead to more repression, however, and this is something I could talk about more in the Q&A because I'm kind of skimming over the rest of the 20th century very quickly here. But East European officials also increasingly aimed to basically imitate Italy and to kind of take a more proactive approach by encouraging economic development at home. So land reform measures, school construction, promotion of domestic industries was all supposed to help reduce the need for emigration. And they created a lot of ambitious new institutions and laws that were intended to protect those citizens who did work abroad, including bilateral treaties, expanded consular services and social services, boarding homes abroad, hospitals, schools, cultural programs. The emigration panic thereby arguably contributed to the development of the European welfare state, as East European officials aimed to extend the state's sovereignty and protection over citizens overseas. And as I mentioned, they were explicitly imitating the Italians with these kinds of policies. Many officials in interwar Eastern Europe continued to blame emigration on Jewish agents, however. In 1923, local officials in a district in the Subcarpathian routes denounced, quote, the large conspiracy of international agents who traffic in humans for ongoing emigration. While the police had arrested several agents in the region, they lamented, agitation has not disappeared thanks to the extensive resources of the local Jews. Not surprisingly, however, the growing number and complexity of emigration and immigration restrictions after World War I only increased the demand for the services of agents and illegal smugglers who promised to help migrants to navigate or circumvent all of these new laws. In the 1930s, East European anti-Semitism escalated with the rise of new fascist parties and the crisis of the Great Depression. Increasingly, government leaders in Eastern Europe and in the West, including the leaders of many Jewish philanthropic organizations, started to promote the mass emigration of Jews from Europe. They saw immigration as the most promising solution to what they called the Jewish question or Jewish problem. In 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt proclaimed, "It must be frankly recognized that the larger East European problem is basically a Jewish problem. The organized emigration from Eastern Europe over a period of years of young persons is not beyond the bounds of possibility. The decrease in economic pressure, the removal over a period of years of a substantial number of persons, the decrease in the birth rate and a natural operation of the death rate should reduce the problem to negligible proportions." Schemes for the mass resettlement of Jews in places like Madagascar, Guyana, Angola, and the Dominican Republic, as well as Palestine, flourished in the mid to late 1930s. And Roosevelt himself secretly funded a project called the M Project during the war, which continued to research various possibilities for resettling basically all of Eastern Europe's Jews somewhere in South America or Africa. This was a logical extension in many ways of interwar emigration politics in East Central Europe. Once emigration came to be seen as a tool for getting rid of national and religious minorities, the line between encouraging immigration and deportation became hazy. I believe that the policies of ethnic cleansing that we tend to associate with the Second World War and its aftermath can be traced in part to this moment when democratic governments sought to use emigration to create homogenous nation-states. The Second World War itself confirmed many of the worst fears of East European policymakers about immigration. Under the Nazi regime of forced labor, Slavs did become the slaves of the 20th century. Following the Nazi defeat, East European governments were, not surprisingly, more determined than ever to reverse the tide of migration from east to west. Post-World War II immigration policies reflected familiar, long-standing concerns: a radical push for national homogeneity, the need for labor to fuel economic reconstruction, especially once 12 million Germans had fled or been expelled, and a pro-natalist ideology that was pervasive across Europe after World War II. By 1947, the Czechoslovak government, which was at the time still a republican democracy, had banned emigration entirely, along with all travel abroad for private purposes, including tourism or visiting family members abroad. The massive wave of ethnic cleansing that followed the Second World War and the new regimes of border control that were imposed after the Second World War were in many ways flip sides of the same coin. Encouraging the emigration of Jews, deporting Germans, and restricting the mobility of desirable citizens formed part of a coherent demographic strategy. Throughout Eastern Europe, the goal of migration policies, as before World War II, was to keep national minorities out and keep desirable citizens in. The more Jews and Germans expelled, the more important it seemed to keep the remaining population behind lock and key. Arguably for East Europeans, immobility was one of the many costs of achieving the long-standing nationalist dream of national homogeneity. Post-war migration policies also represented the opening act to the new and more polarizing ideological dramas of the Cold War. Now more than ever, socialist officials in the East linked emigration to the West to wage slavery and to physical and moral ruin. This rhetoric reflected ongoing concerns about the place of East Europeans in a global racial hierarchy. As Polish displaced persons in Germany emigrated en masse to the West under various labor recruitment schemes, for example, the Polish Red Cross protested, "The recruitment of refugees and displaced persons for labor recalls a slave market, even though slavery has been abolished since Lincoln." Czechoslovakia's post-war ban on immigration was typical of the new policies introduced across the East Bloc. Hungary, Poland, and Romania all sought to seal their borders after the Second World War, typically allowing or forcing only national minorities to emigrate. In Yugoslavia, emigration was also illegal until the government introduced liberalizing reforms beginning in the early 1960s. Abandoning East Germany for the West was considered an act of treason, a special crime labeled Republikflucht, but the divided city of Berlin provided an easy port of exit for East Germans. The flight of 3.5 million East Germans between 1945 and August of 1961 ultimately prompted the construction of the Berlin Wall, which of course became the ultimate symbol of East European immobility. Meanwhile, in the Cold War West, escapees and emigrants from the socialist East became living symbols of totalitarian oppression. To this day, the end of the Cold War remains powerfully linked to images of Berliners dancing and popping champagne corks atop the Berlin Wall. If you travel to the Checkpoint Charlie Museum in Berlin, which I don't really recommend, you can view the remarkable array of vehicles constructed to pierce the Iron Curtain, from hot air balloons to homemade submarines and hollow surfboards. These artifacts are intended, according to the museum's website, to testify to the, quote, ingenuity of the human mind when faced with perilous circumstances. The museum not only served to memorialize the, quote, escapees who risked their lives to win their freedom, however, it also explicitly links freedom of mobility during the Cold War to a struggle for worldwide recognition of human rights and freedom in the contemporary world. Throughout the Cold War, mobility was tightly linked to political freedom in the West. Freedom to emigrate was even included among the rights listed in the United Nations 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I would say that it was during the Cold War that basically, East European states won the battle against emigration but lost the battle to define freedom in the process. The link between freedom and mobility was always contested, however, and in contrast to Cold War rhetoric, Democratic and Republican governments, and not fascists and communists, introduced the first restrictions on mobility in Eastern Europe. They did so in the name of humanitarian protection, insisting that true freedom could not be found in America or West European cities or factories or farms. Real freedom, they argued, consisted of social security and solidarity at home. In 1889, defense attorneys at Wadowice insisted that government measures to restrict emigration infringed on the constitutional rights of Austrian citizens. In a modern state, citizens should no longer be treated like living inventory, which is bound to the land, proclaimed one defense attorney. The prosecution, however, actively contested imagined links between physical mobility, social mobility, and freedom. In his closing statement, the state's attorney proclaimed, "With respect to this accusation that the prosecution does not respect the freedom of emigrants, I have to say that this allegation appears to be a truly bitter irony in that it is made by people who have introduced a slave trade to the free land of Austria and who have created an entire system of human trafficking." In the context of a global labor market in which both American slavery and European serfdom were still living memories, these charges represented more than empty rhetoric. The erection of the Iron Curtain, one of the century's most profound symbols of repression, might in fact be seen as a solution to a problem that was articulated at Wadowice in 1889, the culmination of a century-long effort to protect the freedom of East Europeans by rendering them